And now in studio, we have Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst. Dan, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, guys.
So over the last few hours, the Knesset passed this law requiring the death penalty for Palestinian terrorists, but not for Jewish terrorists. It's getting a lot of criticism in Israel, especially overseas. How do you see it?
It's an abomination, and it's not for nothing that almost every senior legal and security expert was against it, because the type of terrorism that Israel faces is often suicide terrorism that invites death. And in general, Israel's enemies have a cult of fanatical martyrdom. And we almost see this also in the Iran conflict, where it looks like no matter how many of them you kill, they're just not wired to surrender. And it's a real problem. Now, beyond that, it'll create a tit-for-tat kidnapping of Israeli soldiers and killing Israeli soldiers and Israeli citizens. You can pretty much see that coming. And it is Israel, again, taking a step back from the democratic world that has basically walked away from the death penalty in general because it is deemed inhumane and irreversible in the case of mistakes. It's also clearly going to be overruled by the Supreme Court because of inequality under the law.
And that's where I want to go. There are many, many Israelis, probably a majority of the public, that doesn't have faith in the legal system and that sees this as a way to put their stamp on a legal system that they think is too permissive of Palestinian terrorists, of rights of Palestinian prisoners as the legal system sees it. Can't you understand why it is that some Israelis support a law like this, given those circumstances?
Of course. People hate terrorism, and they hate terrorists, and it's easy to rile them up against terrorists.
But it's not about the terrorists,
I can tell you something else. Every poll showed, until about 2015, 2016, when Netanyahu's legal troubles began and his agitation against the police, the prosecutors, and the judges began, the Supreme Court had the second highest approval level of any institution, second only to the military in the public at large. Netanyahu's been inciting against them, a little bit like right-wing populists of late have been doing all around the world, and obviously our support has fallen somewhat. Now, since we know that this law is unequal, if not racist, and it will be almost surely annulled by the Supreme Court, why are they doing it anyway? Precisely for that reason. That is a feature and not a bug. They want the Supreme Court to annul it so they can continue agitating against the court, presenting it as soft on terrorism. And it's a win-win for them because they're going to go to elections with the idea that they're fighting against the courts, any opposition that's soft on terror. And if the government should be replaced by moderates in the next election, which polls suggest is the case, it'll be very difficult for them to repeal this law, because if they do, then the Netanyahu coalition, then in opposition, will portray them as soft on terror. It is pure populism. And by the way, the reputational damage that this does to Israel is clear at a time when Israel's support is cratering, not only in Europe, but in the United States. And one watches with stupefaction as the coalition and Netanyahu himself seem indifferent to all this. In fact, it sort of serves their us versus them pathology, which they seem to think will serve them well with their base. It's really a disgrace.
Now, no question that the legal system is going to be a huge issue going forward in Israeli politics with this law and plenty of others in the background.
Look, do you see with the threats coming from European countries, if this passes, they might take steps against Israel. Do you see this actually leading to anything tangible against Israel coming from the international community, specifically from European countries such as Germany or France who are threatening?
It's obviously possible. Israel's been flirting with various forms of sanctions and efforts to remove it from various EU programs, including technological collaboration programs that Israel needs and benefits from. The world benefits from it. It's a win-win, and Israel's constantly flirting with a diminishment of its status in the European Union, which is Israel's #1 trading partner. Again, to be indifferent to this and to almost welcome it as a chance to once again dump on the Europeans, basically, for populist political reasons, because it's a little bit popular here, as in the U.S., is stunning indifference to what is actually good for the country. It's, as I've said in a different context, as if the government is involved in a conspiracy against the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Dan, I'll tell you how I see the situation in the Gulf. I think a lot of these countries, especially we heard from Hussein Abdul Hussein that the Saudis are on the fence. I think a lot of these countries are waiting to see who wins the war and trying to calibrate their balance based on that. What do you think?
I couldn't disagree with that. They're certainly afraid to join a war actively in a situation where there's no guarantee that Trump doesn't declare victory and walk away a day later, and and then they look foolish. So that's the problem with that. I'm fascinated by Hussein's discussion about Lebanon. I wanted to mention something there. He says Lebanon has to fix its own problem, and it is ridiculous that they can't even expel a single ambassador. How do we expect them to do what needs to be done with Hezbollah?
But how do they do that with so many regional powers involved there on the ground and with a small country?
I actually think Lebanon can't. The Lebanese army simply cannot take on Hezbollah. It has too many Shiites, for one thing. And they fear a civil war, and that's not a crazy fear because up until several decades ago, they were suffering from a decades-long civil war. I understand this. They need much more support. Lebanon needs global support. Now, the world right now doesn't really seek another opportunity for a Middle East quagmire, and their attention is plenty taken up with Iran. I get that. But at some point in the near future, when the Iran issue is maybe behind us, I think this is a job for NATO, basically. Syria needs to be brought in. It needs to be...
Wait, you want Syria to be a member of NATO? Is that what you're saying?
No, Syria needs to be part of the solution with Hezbollah.
Okay, just making sure.
There's sensitivity there as well because Lebanon remembers being occupied by Syria until 20 years ago. But Syria right now is desperate to be a team player and part of Team West, basically. There needs to be the world's biggest news conference with everyone, including the Europeans that are so often confused, including the Arab countries, and everyone needs to say Hezbollah's day is up, and we will put boots on the ground if needed to help the Lebanese get rid of Hezbollah. There's really probably no other way.
So we have French soldiers on the ground in Lebanon fighting Hezbollah?
I would welcome it, and you know what? The French probably would welcome it too because they have some nostalgia for when they were a colonial world power.
Look, France was supposed to host a fundraiser for the Lebanese army at the beginning of March, and, plans in the region were otherwise, but do you really see, very briefly, Lebanon being left to its own demise?
Lebanon cannot be allowed to become a failed state. It is nonstop war. Hezbollah will continue to embroil Lebanon on purpose in conflict with Israel. For that matter, possibly with Syria. Remember that Hezbollah is at loggerheads with a new Syrian government. This can't continue. So we have a failed state that could be a great state, but it's going to need international assistance, and I really do think it can be consensual, because I cannot think of one idiot in the world that isn't in China or Russia or North Korea that wants Hezbollah to continue to destroy the sovereignty of the state of Lebanon.
Mm-hmm. How are you seeing, obviously the expectation that the threat will go from 100 to 0, that is proven in this region an unattainable objective. But do you see this progress significant to preventing what Josiah fears of losing the North?
Yeah, Israel can't allow a return to the status quo antebellum, where Hezbollah not only had 75,000 rockets, or however many roughly in that area, we believe, but was also basically lined up on the border within hundreds of meters of Israeli communities. And that's craziness, because there was always the constant fear that an invasion was coming into the Galilee from the north from Hezbollah. From Lebanon, it doesn't actually wish to attack Israel, not from Gaza. That cannot resume at all. And whereas I'm not one of these people who thinks that October 7th was an opportunity to do great things. You have some noises in that direction in Israel. It was a horrible catastrophe and an embarrassing disaster. But the aftermath of that event, while in many cases problematic, in particular in Gaza, absolutely has improved Israel's strategic position. And mainly, it's established a mindset that any government in Israel, I believe, is going to continue, which is that we can no longer live with these threats on Israel's borders, assuming that the people will be deterred, that the terrorists will be deterred. They won't. And that is why I said before, Lebanon cannot continue to host Hezbollah. They don't want to, and I don't think they should be allowed to, basically.
How are you seeing this? I mean, she said that, and the direct implication is not the U.S., but other areas like China, albeit it has its own kind of buffers, and Europe, but they're not really getting engaged.
Their view is this is not their war, and
but it's their problem.
They're peeved that Trump did not consult with NATO and now comes hat in hand to NATO. For that matter, didn't consult with Congress. And in general, they see an opportunity to to hit back at Trump, basically, for what they see as a year plus of hostility from the U.S., a hostility that has stunned the Europeans. Words can hardly express how angry the Europeans are at the Americans over having elected Donald Trump and over what he's doing and tolerating it for the Congress to tolerate it.
But it's the Iranians that are threatening their oil supply. And if they didn't do it now, if there wouldn't be a war in Iran now, they're proving that they maintain that ability to threaten them whenever they deem fit. So this is...
And also, Dan, the Europeans can't do, presumably, what the Asian countries are doing, which is essentially bribe Iran to let their oil out. It's hard to imagine European countries doing that. So it may not be their war, but it's their problem.
The Europeans are currently unhappy with Trump and unhappy with the war. Does this mean that they should continue to be acquiescent to the evil of the Islamic Republic? Does this mean they're not aware of the fact that they're going to pay a big price also if the Strait of Hormuz isn't opened? Of course it doesn't. They're in a state of cognitive dissonance. The entire world is obviously potentially going to suffer from the downstream effects of this war continuing for some time. But what it really underscores is that the Strait of Hormuz cannot allow, that the world cannot allow the Strait of Hormuz to be threatened in this way. It is yet one more argument for asserting that Iran should not be allowed to continue to suffer under the yoke of its oppressors, who are also a danger to the region and to the world. The difficulty, of course, is that engineering regime change with aerial bombardment versus a fanatical regime that is somewhat indifferent to the death of its leaders is a tricky business. And at some point...
We saw what Donald Trump's answer was today to essentially threaten functionally the end of the regime by saying you will not have electricity or oil if you keep shutting the Strait of Hormuz, turning asymmetry on its head.
Absolutely, and this is a challenge for the various highly optimistic Iranian diaspora figures that want the war to go on, and they're promising us that the people of Iran are going to rise up very soon. There's going to be divisions in the military or even in the IRGC, and soon their back will break. Clearly, the Iranians are betting that Western patience for all this is going to expire before they do. I can't predict what's going to happen, but it really does seem shocking that the Americans, who have been planning for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz for decades, this has been wargamed by CENTCOM for decades, that they should now present as having been surprised. I cannot explain it. I can't analyze it. It's very, very bizarre. And it really is a strategic failure of the war. Moreover, I would have assumed, and indeed, I perhaps foolishly predicted it in writing, and I believe here in the studio, that if the Americans do attack Iran, then surely they will have done prep work on the ground with the military and maybe even with the IRGC, and they won't repeat the mistake of de-Baathification that happened in Iraq. They'll let these people get away with their plunder, and they'll offer amnesty as long as they, in effect, do a military coup once the regime is decapitated. And it simply hasn't happened. So if I look at the strategy behind the war, right now it is not impressive, and it's sad, because for all this, for such strategy to be put into effect, it made sense in the days after the stunning and almost jaw-dropping success of Israeli intelligence and Air Force execution in the first minutes of the war. There has never in history been such a successful state decapitation. And that is when everything else should have gone into motion. Instead, we see the war dragging now in a series of bizarre and inexplicable surprises. And now the world, because Trump did everything possible to offend his allies for a year plus, is unwilling to step in and do itself a favor by joining the war against Iran. It's a pickle, to be sure.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst, thank you very much for joining us in studio this evening.
Pleasure.